Welcome to another episode of Stories Lost. Also in this episode, we stay in the Nordic countries, as I found an old Norwegian article from the magazine UFO number 2 from 1988 that I think should be available to more people. The story begins in an art gallery in Copenhagen in 1977. In an exhibition called Love or Chaos, a now defunct UFO association has a stand. One morning, the author of the article, who is one of the exhibitors at the stand, notices a modest man in his 60s in a white jacket who has listened to the same UFO lecture several times and who always pays particular attention when a slideshow on UFOs is shown. He walks up to the older man and starts making small talk. At first, it is very stiff because the man is very reserved. Eventually, however, he says, "I once talked to a man like the one in these pictures." When he realizes that the author of the article is neither laughing nor shaking his head, but is interested in the man's story, he continues to tell it. In 1955, I was working as a forestry worker on the Gulf of Bothnia in the north of Sweden, with two brothers delivering timber to a sawmill in central Sweden. It was early one morning in July. It was about 6 a.m. and already very hot. We wanted to harvest our assigned lot as quickly as possible and before the heat would completely kill us. We estimated that if we kept a fast pace and didn't take any breaks, we would be done just after lunch. Then we would cool off in the river, which could still be heard roaring between the trunks. I had just felled a large pine tree that the axe had wedged into several times and was wiping the sweat from my brow when I heard a cracking sound, as if a large animal was making its way through the forest. The next moment, both the brothers and I saw a cigar-shaped object zigzagging uncontrollably between the treetops as branches and leaves swirled down. My wildest thought was that it was a small airplane that had lost its wings and was now trying to make an emergency landing. There was a river about 300 to 400 meters away, and it was clear that the object was heading towards it. All three of us realized that the object would hit the ground within seconds, so we ran in the same direction. 15 to 20 meters before we came out of the forest, the object crashed close to the river. But what we had expected, a deafening roar as the gas tank exploded, did not come. Instead, a giant light illuminated the entire area, so bright that the sunlight almost disappeared. It was so powerful that I could actually see through the trees. Like an X-ray, I could see the growth rings inside a tree that was over a meter in circumference. A few seconds later, there was a vacuum wave that sucked everything towards the center of the light. We were thrown forward, all three of us, as branches and leaves swirled past us. It probably only lasted a fraction of a second. Time stood still, and my whole life flashed before my eyes. All the sounds around me no longer existed. When we had calmed down a bit, we went to the impact site to see what had happened. But there was nothing to see except some logs blown down by the wind. We were very surprised and decided to go back and continue our work. But when I got back to the edge of the forest, one of the brothers suddenly shouted, "There's a dwarf in uniform here! The plane must have crashed into the river and he must have been thrown out of it." For a long time we stood speechless and stared at the lifeless figure. He was small in stature, about 110 centimeters tall. When one of the brothers wanted to see if the stranger was still alive, he withdrew his hand with a scream. He turned pale and said that it felt as if several hundred volts had passed through his body. At the same moment, the stranger opened his eyes and said in perfect Swedish, "Don't touch me. It will only be unpleasant for you." "Now you know who I am," he said. He knew in advance what we would answer and simply stated that his question had been correctly understood. Suddenly I became completely calm and I looked at him carefully. His body was harmonious with broad shoulders and a normal shape. His skin was yellowish. His eyes were deep set and completely black. He had 2 large wounds on his cheekbones and forehead. The wounds did not bleed, but were kind of watery. His hair was almost completely white. His earlobes were fused to his neck and looked like shark fins. His hands were small, with 5 narrow fingers without nails, and when he moved his hand it looked as if the ring finger had grown together with the little finger. His uniform was made of reddish metal and was tightly fitted to his body. The head and hands were not covered, but at the feet the suit merged into a kind of shoe. The soles of the feet were grooved, and they vibrated, and for a moment I thought of the caterpillar feet of a tank. The stranger looked at me and nodded his head slightly. There was no doubt that he knew what I was thinking about. His shoes allowed him to roll back and forth without moving his legs. Around his waist, he wore a wide, luminescent metal belt with an unusually large buckle that glowed a light blue color, which later, when he was dead, turned dark blue. In the middle of the buckle was a kind of sign in yellow that resembled the letters U and V, and it looked like the V was inside the U. He knew I was studying him, and he said, "It is thanks to the suit that I am still alive. Inside I am completely destroyed." His right hand disappeared into the suit at the hip, but I saw no pocket. He took out a rectangular object. It was the size of a matchbox and had 12 small indentations. With a metal fork attached to the object, he stabbed the different holes several times. When he was done, he tried to throw the object away. He smiled and said, "Don't touch it. It will tell them what has happened so they can come and look for me. Where I come from, there is also someone waiting." The stranger then lay quiet a while as asleep. It was clear that he was in great pain. Suddenly the brothers looked at each other, a little confused, and without further ado they just walked back into the forest without a word. When I later, years later, reconstructed the story, I became convinced that the stranger somehow told the brothers to leave without saying a word. After the brothers had left, I sat down and talked to the stranger for 2 hours. The alien came from somewhere near the constellation we call the Eagle. Several intelligences from outer space visit us, and some are so advanced in their development that we can only see them when they materialize or dematerialize to visit a parallel universe in Earth's orbit. Some visit the Earth to take samples of the soil, with a view to settling here later. Some also have contact with people on Earth, and have had it for hundreds of years. The old man continued. Just before the stranger died, he gave me a folded sack from his invisible pocket and said, "When I die, the light will disappear from my body, and then you will pull this sack over me, and together with the other 2 men you will throw me into the river. Then I will disappear. Afterwards, you must rinse yourself well with water so that you don't get sick." He had difficulty breathing, and I saw that he did not have long to live. The light around his body grew dimmer, and the light blue buckle gradually darkened. He looked at me and smiled. Then he said something in a language I have never heard before or since. Then he said something in Swedish, and the last sentence I managed to understand was, "You have come against your will, and you go away without wanting to. Our life is like vapor." He said a few more words, but his voice was so weak that I could not understand what he said. But I am convinced that he prayed to some god before he died. I was moved. With the help of the 2 brothers, I put him in the sack, and we put him in the river. The sack smelled of sulfur, and he was quite heavy, probably between 90 and 100 kilograms. When the bag came into contact with the water, it started to sizzle and bubble around it, and we realized there was a chemical process going on. After 5 minutes, everything was gone. He had probably wanted to throw himself into the river for a quick death, rather than lie in pain on the riverbank for 2 hours. He probably wanted to die alone and think about his home, several light years out in the universe. "That's all," said the old man. "I worked a few more years with the brothers, but we rarely talked about what had happened. Both of them are dead now, but I remember it as if it had happened yesterday. Even though it has been 22 years since it happened, I recognized the stranger in one of the pictures. By the way, I thought I was the only one who knew about this kind of UFO, because I have seen many pictures and drawings of visitors from outer space, but I have never seen anyone who looked like him." The old man then took out a piece of metal. "Look," he said. He laughed confidently and said, "A few days after the incident, I walked around the site. The little box the stranger had thrown away was gone, but the metal fork was there in the grass, shining. I have kept it as proof that I did not dream what happened." He turned and left, and as the author of the article stood there gasping for breath, he disappeared into the crowd. An anonymous man who, with his story and his evidence, could be on the front page of any newspaper in the world. Yes, a story that makes you wonder how many similar stories that are out there. Stories we never get to hear because those who experience them are afraid to tell them for fear of being mistrusted or ridiculed. And saddest of all, Many have probably followed their bearers to their graves. Stories lost. Forever. Thank you for watching Stories Lost, and a special thank you for all the great feedback on the last episode.